Venezuelans choose 6 more years of President Hugo Chavez. What can and should he accomplish in his next term? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm It was the toughest electoral challenge Hugo Chavez has faced since he came to power 14 years ago. But the opposition simply couldn't overcome his enormous popularity. Voters re-elected him by a 10% margin, and it was an historic turnout. More than 80% of the country's 19 million registered voters came out to vote. It's his Bolivarian revolution that won him the support of millions. And as he claimed victory late on Sunday, Chavez vowed to expand his socialist programs, which have reduced poverty, as well as expanded access to healthcare and education. Over the next 6 years, though, Chavez will also have to address major challenges, including government corruption, inefficiencies, and a high crime rate. Al Jazeera's Latin America editor, Lucia Newman, has been covering the election, and when I spoke to her earlier, she said the election process was a resounding success.
Absolutely, and that's something that everyone agrees on. It was just how successful the whole process was. There was a lot of speculation, and some of it was fanned by the opposition, some of it by the government side, that the loser would not accept this result and that they would be questioning the system itself. And it has been really, it's gotten full marks. It's being seen as transparent, perhaps one of the best electoral systems in the world because of all the safeguards that it has, and this not according to the Venezuelans, but according to overseas observers and monitors such as the Carter Center, for example, she had.
So moving forward, what impact might Hugo Chavez's reduced majority have on his next term, do you think?
He really doesn't have, Shihab, what I would call much of a reduced majority. He wanted to have won with an even bigger margin, but after 14 years in power, how many presidents can say that they are re-elected with a 10% more of the vote than their rival? I mean, that's a huge majority, and more importantly, he still has the absolute majority in the National Assembly to pass any legislation that he wants, and that's the key thing right now. There will be new elections for mayors and for governors in December. But after this victory, it's very likely that he will do very well, much better than what many of the Chavez people in the Chavez camp had expected.
Give us a sense then of the regional impact of another term for Hugo Chavez. How important is this for the region?
Well, you know, Shihab, it is not just the people who support the government who are breathing easy now, but so are the governments of particularly Cuba and Nicaragua, as well as to a certain extent Bolivia. These countries, and I underline Cuba especially, depend on help from Venezuela, which is paid for with the oil wealth of this country. President Chavez has been very, very generous in subsidizing Cuba, especially to pay for its energy bill, and part of the oil that is given to Cuba at cut-rate prices and sometimes for free is then resold on the international market, which gives some kind of cash flow to the Cuban government. The same thing with Nicaragua. President Daniel Ortega was re-elected with a very handsome margin himself just recently, thanks to the social programs that he can bankroll with the money that President Chavez gives him, or with the cut-rate oil that he gives him. So for these countries, it's very important that President Chavez be re-elected, and they can certainly breathe easy now.
What about relations with the U.S.? Chavez said that he would vote for President Obama. He called Obama a good man. He said he wanted to usher in a new era of normal relations with the U.S. What might that mean?
Yes, he did. I found that very interesting. President Chavez really does blow hot and cold with the U.S. government. He has been very critical of Obama in the past, particularly over the role in Libya and now in Syria. But he seems to feel that Obama is the lesser of two evils, and he said that if he were an American, he would vote for Obama, and he said that he was sure that if Obama was a Venezuelan, he would have voted for him. I'm not so sure that that's true. But yes, he is certainly extending an olive branch to the U.S. government. He'd like to have a more peaceful, more normal relations with Washington.
So we begin first with the impact of Chavez's victory on the Americas and beyond. Joining us from New York is Gregory Wilpert, author of Changing Venezuela by Taking Power, the Policies of the Chavez Presidency. Here in the studio, Deborah James. She's the Director of International Programs at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. And we're also joined by Laura Rojas. She's a member of the Capriles campaign here in DC. Greg Wilpert, first of all, then, what do you think Chavez meant about normalization of relations with the US? Are we expecting anything different?
Well, the main thing is that we have to remember that for the past 2 years or more, there haven't been any ambassadors in the respective countries. That is, both countries had withdrawn their ambassadors. So if Obama gets reelected, I'm sure they will exchange ambassadors once again. If Mitt Romney were elected, I think the situation would probably remain tense.
Yeah, it's interesting because Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan have mentioned, Deborah, Venezuela a few times and suggesting that President Obama is some sort of appeaser. I suppose what's often forgotten is how highly dependent both economies are on each other with the flow of oil.
Well, they certainly are mutually dependent on the flow of oil. But I think it's been interesting to see that under Obama, we've actually had, in many cases, a worsening of relations with Latin America. We've had several countries, not just Venezuela, but also Ecuador and Bolivia, that for much of the time we haven't had ambassadors with. And I think really the region is honestly just too peaceful and democratic for it to be a big high priority for him. And he's unfortunately left it to underlings who have really used sort of an outdated Cold War lens to look at the region based on sort of with us or against us if you do what the U.S. says in foreign policy, rather than looking at the fact that there's some actually very interesting changes happening in the region. And part of that is that these countries are becoming independent with their foreign policy. And there's really no reason why we couldn't have good relations with Venezuela in the future.
Lara, I mean, from your point of view, as you were trying to drum up support for Capriles, I mean, did you see a huge amount of engagement from the Obama administration and from other actors in Washington, or were they relatively hands-off? What were your senses?
I think that the international community has his eyes on Venezuela and on this process, and we have welcomed those eyes. Not only from the United States, but also from other countries in the hemisphere. We would like a relationship with the United States that, yes, respect our sovereignty, but we also want Mr. Chavez to respect the democratic charter and respect other countries' opinions. So what we would like is to have a strong hemispheric cooperation, and the United States is part of the hemisphere, and we would like to remain that way.
But arguably, wasn't what Mr. Chavez was doing was strengthening the hemispheric cooperation, just not in a more independent way. But what it meant was it was a true strengthening of hemispheric cooperation, not simply being under the thumb of the U.S., I suppose, is how he was.
Well, but again, I mean, it's dividing. It's dividing the U.S. and Canada on one side, the rest of the hemisphere on the other side, and sometimes even divided against some countries in the hemisphere because they don't follow their own Chavez policies. I think in foreign relations, the president has followed the same kind of policy that domestically dividing, polarizing, always going against whoever is not following his policies, and that is something that will continue. Obviously, I don't think any change in that, even though he is truly dependent on the U.S. market, especially for the oil, but for many imports too.
Do you see that, Greg? I mean, I think one of the most remarkable relationships that we've seen over the last few years is Chavez and relationship with Juan Manuel Santos of Colombia, this pro-American, nominally right-wing president and so forth. I mean, is it about left and right? What is going on, do you think?
Yeah, I don't think it's really just about left and right. I mean, that plays a role, but we have to recognize that there is an enormous division between the United States and Canada on one side and the rest of Latin America. I mean, an economic divide. And what Chavez does, just like also as your other guest was saying, domestically, there's also an enormous divide. So constantly to blame Chavez for dividing the continent or for dividing the country is, I think, a way to paper over very profound differences that do exist. And Chavez is trying to resolve these differences precisely by building up the strength of Latin America as a whole, by contributing towards its integration and going beyond the left and right divide within Latin America, such as you mentioned the cooperation with Colombia, but also right now Chile is participating, for example, actively in the construction of, which is a right-wing government, in the construction of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, which is a new organization, and Chile is very actively involved in that. So there's many ways that this left-right debate is actually being overcome. Because everybody sees an interest in building up Latin America first before they just blindly sell and so to speak, throw themselves at the feet of the United States.
Can you see any benefit in that, Lara? Capriles was very critical about most of Chavez's Latin America policy, particularly, for example, his support for Cuba and other countries. But isn't that just wise foreign policy to really nurture regional relationships?
Well, Capriles, for example, met with President Chavez, as you know, and in the meeting, Capriles stated the notion that a new government will cooperate strongly to support the peace process in Colombia. And we will have wanted to establish the best relationship with all the countries in the hemisphere. He also said that he is an admirer of Lula's policies, and he will follow the Brazilian model. And it is true. I mean, it's not that President Chavez invented a division. I mean, what I wanted to say is that he built part of his policies on the base of polarization. That he takes the division and makes a policy out of that. And with Cuba, well, our problem with Cuba is that the government has given Cuba a lot of influence in Venezuela. And at the same time, he has given Cuba a lot of support, which certainly is good because Venezuela has always cooperated with all the countries, and especially less developed countries in the hemisphere. But I mean, that he has done that, taking resources out of Venezuelans for things that are needed in Venezuela.
Deborah James, something that Lara just said there seemed quite fundamental to the debate that one always has about Chavez, that he built, I think you said he built things on polarization.
Yeah.
Sorry, isn't that just a byproduct, though, perhaps, of, I mean, if you do focus on the poor majority instead of the rather vocal and rich minority in Venezuela, and you start going against U.S. interests, isn't polarization more of a byproduct of your policies rather than an end in itself? It's good.
Well, it could be likened to the situation, I think, of the debate in the United States, where we've had sort of 93% of the accumulated benefits of the last 20 years go to the top couple of percent. But if you mention that or draw attention to it or say, I want to focus on the poor and middle class, you're considered to be engaging in class war, when actually it's the situation that brought you to that could have been earning that name. Venezuela experienced a situation from 1980 to 1998, the 18 years before Chavez came to office, where its economy contracted 14%. It's one of the worst economic devastation in recorded history, and that exacerbated greatly the inequalities of this country. And this is during, these oil governments did not use their money to reduce poverty. So he got a situation where he has reduced the Gini coefficient significantly in the country. So he has actually reduced inequality.
The equality in society, the Gini
yes, that measures inequality in society. So he's reduced that, and at the same time, in terms of the international relations, is exactly what you said. Some of the programs that he's built on, like having a preferential trade agreement with Cuba, some of these programs existed before him. They were called the San Jose Accords, and he provided, Venezuela provided preferential oil to poor countries in the region. This makes sense. If you have your oil price skyrocket, you want to make sure that poor countries in your region aren't devastated by that. And he's continued that policy, as well as having a big focus on regional integration, which just makes sense from a national policy point of view, more so than doing whatever the United States wants you to do.
Greg Wilper, though, there is one area, though, that does raise many eyebrows on the left as well, though, is whether he looks at his global foreign policy, whether Chavez looks at his global foreign policy purely in relation to US hegemony and the need for a multipolar world, and not necessarily individual situations. I guess Syria is the main example right now, where a lot of people on the left are saying, look, we need, clearly, you need a multipolar world, but when Assad is killing his own people, perhaps you need a more nuanced foreign policy than simply saying, right, we're just going to back you all the way.
Yes, I agree. I mean, Chavez is looking at the big picture. In that sense, he's usually focused very much on opposing the U.S. imperialism and U.S. influence around the world. And one way to do that is to strengthen allies with some perhaps not so savory individuals and leaders around the world. Also, he bases his foreign policy to a large extent on the personal ties he develops with them, and doesn't pay so much attention to exactly what these leaders are doing in their own countries. I mean, Gaddafi is the other example, so these are kind of difficult situations, especially for the left to take. On the other hand, one has to realize that I think a president is in charge of implementing a foreign policy that is in the interests of their nation, and so if it does support Venezuela, that's a strong argument in favor of that. On the other hand, you shouldn't always ignore what's going on in those other countries as well.
All right, we're going to move on to domestic issues that Venezuela faces, or that Chavez faces. Teresa Bona reports from Caracas on what some voters are hoping the president will accomplish in his next term.
The streets of Caracas went back to normal on Monday, but there's still lots of emotions going around between those who love Hugo Chavez and those who hate him. Even though Chavez won with 54% of the votes and his policies are widely popular, there are still many challenges ahead.
Revisarse él mismo como ser.
Hugo Chavez has to reinvent himself and his government. He's an almost perfect man with honest feelings, but that's not enough. The people know he got less votes than expected, so the government knows the people will demand more.
We want the revolution to continue, and the triumphs and the missions and the pensions, everything that is good for the people. And we want the government to address the problem of insecurity.
Those who voted against him say that they're worried that Chavez will be in power for 6 more years.
I am worried about Chavez for my children and grandchildren. I told my daughter I'm about to leave the country, but no, I'm going to stay here and keep on fighting.
Hugo Chavez said that he's hoping to be a better president in the coming years and ask all Venezuelans to put an end to the enormous divisions that continue to exist in this country.
Now, Laura Rojas, I mean, clearly it was a very significant performance from Capriles and the opposition. Chavez, they're acknowledging there have been mistakes in the past, pledging to fix them. Does that give you some hope then?
It's very interesting that President Chavez said two things, especially in the last month of the campaign. One, he wants to unite the country, and that talks a lot about the polarization that exists in the country, and that he has recognized by saying, yes, I want peace among all Venezuelans, and I want the division to end. And that we need to acknowledge that Capriles had brought that to the process. The second thing that he acknowledged was that his government hasn't been as efficient as he could, and he said it. That is not the main problem. The main problem is that we need to build this socialist country. So I ask you, Venezuelans, to give me your vote, even though the problem now is it's not if you have hospitals, it's not if you have schools, it's not if you have power or anything. The problem is.
But they do have more hospitals and schools, don't they? I mean, people do have more hospitals and schools.
Not necessarily. That's not true. The health system is not working properly. The education system is not working properly. Yes, Chavez has built a lot of social programs, no doubt. And Capriles said that he wants to continue those social programs programs and also to improve them, and especially to make them available to all Venezuelans, irrespectively if they vote or not vote for President Chavez.
Isn't that the one thing that Chavez can claim to have done, though?
No, but he hasn't done it. He hasn't done it. If you need to sign, for President Chavez policies in order to be benefited for a particular program, then those programs are not for all Venezuelans. And so. One thing is to say that you reduce inequality by providing more education and providing more opportunities for employment and providing more opportunities for companies to produce and export, Venezuelan-made goods. And another thing is that you have reduced inequality just by transferring cash to many people that need the cash. There's no question about that. Okay, we're not questioning the needs of the population. What we are questioning here is that cash transfer programs, social programs, are there to be complementary with productive policies.
Well, that's interesting.
And that is what has been lacking during the Chavez years.
Deborah James.
Well, the data doesn't bear that out, unfortunately. I mean, the Chavez years have been some of the most productive for the economy as a whole. The rich have also gotten richer. The middle class has gained. The poor have benefited the most. I think that's what most people would say ought to happen. Yes, if you look at the economic growth in Venezuela, it has some of the best economic growth of Latin America. Unfortunately, it had a very bad period when the opposition tried to take the economy down by having an oil strike. It also had a bad period during the recession from 2008 to the first part of 2009. It has been in recovery for 2.5 years since then. And I think that it shows in the votes. I mean, you have a situation where the participation in education has expanded enormously in the country. Even in superior education, there are double the amount of students in superior education. It's very difficult to find somebody honest in Venezuela who will say that the healthcare situation isn't vastly superior for so many people. I mean, the infant mortality, all the human development indicators have gotten so much better. And yet you have an opposition that's not wanting to recognize that. It's really sad. And then to say that they're going to keep doing the social programs, but then not recognizing the things that have actually brought the benefits for which so many people have reelected this president.
Sure. Have you been in the country lately?
20 times.
Yeah, 20 times. Have you go to the supermarket and see what products are being sold in the supermarkets? Have you talked, for example, with young people and know how difficult it is for them to find jobs? Do you know that the rate of unemployment is 11% and is even higher within the young population? Okay, have you talked to people in the streets that cannot take their child to the health care? Because those social programs, Barrio Adentro, for example, which is the health program for excellence, with the help of the Cubans, are not working in the barrio. So
I think it really depends. I mean, there's anecdotes for every side. And
so you
have to look at the data.
Statistics, but the facts.
All right, Gregory Wilcox,
totally
perhaps you can tie some of these strands together. Actually, there is that criticism from the left as well, though, that he didn't really even institute 21st century socialism. He was mainly using oil profits within a very capitalist structure of using transnational oil companies and speculation and things like this. I mean, it wasn't necessarily very socialist. And there is that criticism from the left as well as the right, actually, sometimes.
Yes, actually, you could say that his programs are largely social democratic in that sense of redistributing wealth and bringing in the state into a much greater role in the economy. And I think these kind of things just cannot be denied. And of course, you can always bring, like Deborah says, you can always bring anecdotes, and you can bring them on all sides. I mean, I've been to the barrios, and I find plenty of people who are very happy about the opportunities they've had through being able to finish high school, to be able to attend the university, and now even become a lawyer. It's something that they could never even imagine before. So these things, I mean, it's a fact. Also, if you look at the unemployment rate, for example, it's much lower than it was when Chavez came into power. Sure, it's high still, and still 45% is employed in the informal market, but when Chavez came into office, it was closer to between 55 and 60%. So, I mean, these things, there's still a long ways to go, and that's, of course, something that many people rightfully criticized Chavez for. And of course, and again, it affects perhaps the youth more, and they are more critical of this because that's the only government that they've experienced in the last 14 years. But if you make any kind of objective comparison towards the past, there's been tremendous tremendous movement forward. But if it's really reached 21st century socialism, that's kind of difficult to say. Chavez has promised now to basically move further in that direction, and what I imagine he means by that is to give a even stronger role to the communal councils and to the communes to deepen basically participatory democracy. And that's something I think that Venezuelans have rewarded Chavez for as well in this election.
All right, we have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Gregory Wilpert, thank you very much. Deborah James, thank you. Lara Rojas, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering.